it's so great to be with you. I know there's a sort of heaviness on the building, but I should say something. I don't know if those of you that are sort of following the details about Charlie Kirk, his apparently the second question that was asked in this forum was about transgender mass shooters, believe it or not. And then he was shot and killed. Something else you might not know is that he has done so much in TPUSA to elevate this tragedy that we've seen unfold before us of children and girls in particular being sucked into the gender ideology vacuum. And it's elevated Chloe Cole in particular, who's sort of the one sort of name that almost everyone recognizes among the detransitioners, but there are many that are coming along after her. And so when I came to Heritage 4 years ago, I used to be a professor at the Catholic University, just 3 miles this way. And I read Ryan Anderson's book called When Harry Became Sally. Well, it came out in 2018, and Ryan was a friend. And it was the first book in the policy arena about this issue that we now call gender ideology. And it had the distinct privilege of being banned by Amazon.com. That's how sort of effective this book was. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. I'm really glad people like Ryan and Heritage are working on this. And then in 2020, during the crazy COVID lockdowns, I read another book, actually in manuscript form before it came out, by a California journalist named Abigail Schreier. The book is called Irreversible Damage. And it was the book that really broke the story for just ordinary Americans that weren't following this stuff about so-called gender-affirming care, this medical intervention that starts with social transition, name changes, goes on to puberty blockers, and then cross-sex hormones, and then finally gender transition surgery as a way of treating childhood distress over their sexed bodies, the kind of thing that just completely sounds insane to most people. And when I read the book, my brain just sort of snapped, and I thought, I got to get involved in this fight or I won't live with myself. And I told Ryan, I said, hey, if you leave Heritage, maybe I'll apply for your job, and then if I get it, I will, there'll be two of us in the policy arena in DC working on this. That's how few people were really working on it at the time. Well, then that happened. About a year later, he became the president of Ethics and Public Policy Center. Job opening occurred at Heritage, and my daughter reminded me. I applied, and that's how I ended up at Heritage. Literally, I was so angry about this and knew that, okay, Heritage is a really amazing organization. I thought that when I was on the outside, and I think it on the inside, because we work as an entire organization on policies. So we're not just sort of shop where people are writing stuff. We actually work internally to coalesce around particular policy positions. And the weakness is that can take a while and it can be hard, but the strength of that is that we can move as an entire organization. So if we decide, okay, we're gonna do everything we can to stop crazy gender-affirming care in the States, then we can tell our Heritage Action colleagues in the States and our Sentinels, who are the sort of grassroots folks, that this is what we're gonna do. And so that's a sort of an amazing thing. So I know I wouldn't just be sort of one policy guy writing this thing, but I can tell you even 2021, 2022, there were a few things that happened. Is there anyone here from Arkansas? I know there's some Alabamans here, but in Arkansas in 2021, that was the first bill to stop pediatric gender medicine in the state of Arkansas. And then in 2022, one other law in Alabama. But I can tell you as late as August of 2022, if you were here in DC and trying to meet with Republican staffers, they still really didn't want to talk about this issue. It just made them uncomfortable. I mean, you could tell it's like boys and girls bathrooms, like double mastectomies for girls. You could just tell the body language is like, give us something else to talk about. But they said, maybe we'll talk about the sports thing. That's maybe something we can do. And I thought, okay, this is going to be a one and done. They'll say something about sports or not. Well, as it turns out, a few things happened. People like Chloe Cole, people like Riley Gaines, right? Those pictures of Riley Gaines. And then I think there was like that final picture of Rachel Levin, the number 2 person, right? I really think this is a blessing from God. Just that picture at some point, just enough people said, okay, I'm done with this. The entire issue has changed 180 degrees, and we've watched it happen in about 2.5 years, both politically and in a policy arena, but also culturally, what you're allowed to say and not allowed to say, which is just absolutely remarkable. So what I want to do is give you a few minutes of what's happened, especially in the States so far, which is really absolutely remarkable. I think that this topic will be studied among public policy people about, okay, can this be replicated or is this unique to this issue? Because so much has happened that, I honestly almost desire just to say, wow, we've won. But we haven't won. We've started. But the job is absolutely not done yet. And in fact, a lot of the work still remains for the states. And so if you're a state activist and working in your state legislature, there's still a lot to do. But I'm a philosopher, and so I always want to sort of define terms first. So what is gender ideology? That's the term that we're now, people have sort of agreed to use. I can explain this to you fairly simply. It is essentially an ideology that seeks to displace and sideline the category of sex as a biological category with two other categories. Gender identity, which is something like an internal sense of gender. I'm not making this up. If you Google this, it will be gender identity as an internal sense of gender. Now, what's wrong with that definition? Anybody know? You got the word gender on both sides, right? You don't want to use the same word in a definition that you're trying to define, but they'll never connect it to sex. So it's literally an internal sense of being male or female or both or neither or somewhere in between or non-binary or a million other things, right? Purely psychological state, independent of the body. That's absolutely crucial. And then if you say, okay, well, this is weird because I thought I'd remembered from biology that there were males and females. I don't know, it's complicated. But what about sex? It's on my birth certificate. If someone is a committed gender ideologue, this is how they will answer. They won't say, oh yeah, well that's true biologically. They will say, well, what happened is that doctors became accustomed to associating different body parts with male or female. It's a kind of stereotype. It's like a Western Christian construct, right? And so they associated that based on the body parts of the baby that came out. And if you got male, that's what they associated you with. If it's female, they did that. But that doesn't tell you what your true self is. That doesn't tell you what your gender identity is, right? Only you know that. All right, so this is it, right? This sounds crazy. You think, is that really what's being said? I'm telling you, half the job in the policy arena was persuading people that this is really happening in their school, and it's not just in Berkeley, California. It's just absolutely everywhere in the developed world, all at once, before any of us were paying attention. It's that deranged. It's precisely because it is that deranged, though, that I absolutely was convinced that it was not going to succeed in the long term. It was just a question of whether thousands of kids were going to be harmed or damaged, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. That was the open question. But this was going to go down simply because it's contrary to manifest realities and truths that every person and every culture and every religion at every time and place has recognized. Right? We all develop, by the time we're 5 or 6 years old, a very firm conviction that there are boys and girls. There are adults and kids, and there's males and females. And by the time you're in about the first grade, you get actually really good at telling the difference. That's just a basic reality, and that's true everywhere. And if you've noticed, if this were a social construct, here's what you would expect, that some cultures in certain languages would have like 3 categories or 4, right? Or maybe they have male and female, and let's say you've learned the words male and female in English, and you associate people with that, and then you go to, I don't know, Outer Mongolia or something, right? It turns out they've got male and female, but it refers to totally different groups of people, right? Like they don't really overlap. That never happens. You never learn a language where it's like that whole third of the room in this language is considered female, whereas in English we consider the male. Why does that matter? That's the best possible evidence you can have that we observe this about the world, right? And then we develop words and language to describe it. And so that is what gender ideology is opposed to. But just in case you're still skeptical that it actually denies basic biology, I present for your consideration the most popular catechetical aid for teaching gender ideology to elementary school students. This is the gender unicorn, all right? So the purpose of this is just to get kids thinking not in terms of male or female, as themselves and their peers, but in terms of these different gendered aspects of ourselves. And so you can have a gender expression, which is sort of how you act, how you dress. You can have a gender identity, which notice the gender identity here is a thought. It's a thought bubble of a rainbow. So it has nothing to do with the body. It's a purely psychological state. Notice also, by the way, that the unicorn is androgynous, neither male nor female, right? And so you have these different gendered aspects of themselves. You have a type of attractions and orientations. And then what you might expect is at least they've got a category in there for sex. They don't. They have a category called sex assigned at birth. That's gender ideology. And that is exactly what is generally being taught to kids, unless the parents are absolutely riding herd on it. And don't think that just because you're in a red state, it's not happening. We could tell you horror stories all day about what's happening in Whitefish, Montana, or you pick it, Norman, Oklahoma. Pick your conservative town in your state, and I'm telling you it's happening there. So this is the sort of outrage. I think COVID, in a sense, was a blessing because a lot of parents discovered what was happening and were outraged by it. So that's gender ideology. So what's been done? What was interesting about the last 4.5 years or so is that the Biden administration, on its first week after Joe Biden was inaugurated, issued a document essentially saying, it was a sort of manifesto that the federal government and the administration were going to implement gender ideology in every federal agency. In fact, it was an order for every federal agency to develop, sort of gender lessons and sort of structure their programs around that. So yes, the Bureau of Indian Affairs had to figure out how to do this, right, under Biden. That was happening in Washington, D.C. We never had meetings with people at HHS then. But guess what happened? The states woke up, and the states did what temporarily the federal government would not do, and in fact did the opposite. And so there's just this kind of amazing run of policy successes. And the first was probably just bills to redefend and reinforce the parental rights that people already have, but are very often ignored. A woman named January Littlejohn, a mother in Tallahassee, Florida, was and is a friend that works on these issues now. She had won the Volunteer of the Year for her daughter's school a previous year. And then one day, she discovered that her daughter was going by a male name and being treated as a male and going in male bathrooms at her own daughter's school. So she called the principal, and they couldn't really disclose it. And what she discovered is that her school and schools all around the country have so-called gender support plans already in place. So think of it as like a binder. And so if it's someone who you thought was a girl, right, suddenly announces that she's a boy, the entire school kicks in, right? So imagine this, that say a 7th grader has the power with a word to completely reorient the staff, the principal, the teachers, and all of her peers. That's an incredible power, and it's always done behind the parents' backs because the parents are, regressive and prejudiced and might not really think that their daughters are boys, right, or sons. Well, they picked on the wrong woman, actually, and the wrong girl because January Littlejohn worked very hard, and then Ron DeSantis passed a parental rights and education bill that banned this and gave parents a private right of action to sue in Florida when they did this. This is the kind of first step. You have to stop secret social transitioning, which, by the way, is still happening in lots of other states. So that's been happening. The sports bills and private spaces laws have been happening around the state. But the really kind of big one, and the one that I thought was the absolute prize on this, was to close down pediatric gender clinics who are engaged in these ghoulish medical protocols. When we started, even 2 years ago, there were 79 of these clinics, plus about 600 Planned Parenthood clinics that dispense cross-sex hormones. Those are slowly, and I think at this point, starting to quickly close, because what's happened between, say, 2021 and the present is something like 27 states of the union passed bills restricting these procedures for minors. So, like I said, one in 2021, one in 2022, something like, 17, Laura? I can't remember in 2023, and then we got to 27. A remarkable achievement, and I'm absolutely convinced these are all going to close down. But that's just kind of the medical aspect of this. We quickly, when we really got into this, discovered, strangely, that no political entity in the United States of America, so far as we could tell, whether federal government or state governments, had ever bothered to define what male and female are. Title IX didn't do this. They just sort of treated males and females as obvious. The problem is gender ideology contested this question. And so if states wanted to keep separating sports and bathrooms, they needed actual definitions of males and females. And so a few of us here at Heritage and at ADF and other places worked really hard for about a year to get absolutely bulletproof definitions of male and female for state purposes. The first state to pass this was in the state of Idaho. I won't bore you with all the details. Some of my friends here are like, oh no, I hope he doesn't go into the details here. But it was actually a really important thing. We live at the moment in which the government has to be able to precisely define male and female if we're going to continue recognizing the differences between that. And so that has continued apace. A couple of other things happened, though, in the process. We were just sort of chugging along, working on these issues at the state level. And then this guy, Donald Trump, got reelected as president, right? Absolutely unbelievable, less than a year ago. And so what we were thinking of as a state issue, so abolitions of pediatric gender medicine, crazy gender ideology in schools, crazy sort of sports things, crazy definitions of male and female, suddenly became executive orders that the president signed either the first day he was inaugurated or within a few days after that. So it just completely has changed the game, at least temporarily federally. And then one of the laws that was passed, this one in Tennessee, found its way to the Supreme Court here just this last year. It was heard in December, and then of course in June, it was decided in favor of the state of Tennessee, which in effect allows these other state laws to be upheld. And I won't steal too much of Jonathan's thunder because I know he's going to talk about that. I can tell you, someone working on these issues, we didn't expect it to get to the Supreme Court nearly this quickly. And so you might think, okay, this is awesome. So the president has these executive orders. You have HHS guidance. What I didn't mention is there are at least 5 federal agencies that have units that are going after this,